The last Green Sahara and the memory of water. So the land itself tells this story, especially in the Sahara. It's hard to imagine now, but for thousands of years, the Sahara was green, full of lakes, rivers, animals, and people. Families herded cattle, fished from deep waters, and painted crocodiles and hippos on canyon walls because they lived beside them. Then Earth's orbit shifted. Slowly, the monsoon rains pulled south, and the Sahara began to dry. Grasslands browned, rivers shrank, lakes collapsed inward. You would think a drying landscape would mean the end of floods, but instability works the opposite way. As the Sahara dried, the climate became chaotic. Mega lakes like ancient Lake Chad sometimes overflowed violently when their natural basins shifted. Sudden hyper-intense storms crashed down on riverbeds, turning them into walls of water. Sediment from the Nile shows super floods during the same period, water levels rising far beyond their usual reach. So we had a dry world, violent floods, and they're both true at the same time. So it is ironic how when you go from the Green Sahara, which means that it was actually warmer, about 7 degrees warmer, and then it would bring more monsoons to the northern part of Africa, which is right where the Sahara is. Now, during this transition from about 12,000 to 5,000 BCE, we had that transition take place, and you would think that it would just keep getting drier and drier. So you could just imagine how it just started getting drier and drier, and then Noah was building an ark, and people were like, dude, what are you doing? Like, why are you building an ark? Like, we have barely had any rain. So I want you to keep that in your mind as we go through this, because people living in this unstable world, they didn't forget this. This lake bursting through its shoreline, a valley drowned unexpectedly, a storm returning with strange fury. Experiences like these carve themselves into memory. And here's a good quick paraphrase of Psalm 18:16. It says, "The waters surged, the depths were exposed, creation's foundations were laid bare." That's exactly how chaos felt. And when these families left the collapsing Sahara and moved toward safer ground, toward the Nile, the Jordan, the Mediterranean coast, they didn't just bring tools or livestock. They brought the stories of a world that had lost its boundaries. Those memories will become the soil out of which later flood traditions grew, not as imagination, but as interpretations of what people had lived through. Now here we go with the migration and the birth of order. So when people finally walked out of the falling Sahara, they weren't just changing addresses. They were stepping from chaos into something that felt like order. After weeks or months of crossing hard, thinning land, they reached the Nile. Imagine arriving there with Sahara memories still burning in your mind, lakes that vanished, rivers that betrayed their channels, storms that arrived like ambushes. You could just imagine Noah and his sons and the generations that followed after that. Now you stand beside a river that keeps a schedule. So after that period of time, after the drying of the Sahara that started to take place, and then this major flood that took place, and then more drying, people had to go back towards where water was, the Nile and all the rivers that are around it. And we have a lot of archaeological evidence that that's where these civilizations were migrating after the flood period. So when you stand beside this river that keeps a schedule, okay, it rises, it spreads over the floodplain, it withdraws, it does this again year after year. There's a routine. They can prepare themselves for the next one and the next one and the next one. And in Genesis chapter 8, verse 22, here's a quick paraphrase of it. It says, "As long as the earth endures, planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, these rhythms do not cease." For people who had just fled a world where nothing kept its rhythm, that kind of predictability would feel like mercy. And it was mercy. I mean, you just imagine how Noah felt after this had happened. I mean, it was divine mercy that the human race even survived this horrible time. There was a huge genetic bottleneck that took place, and the genetics of people was brought down to a very small number, and we have scientific evidence of this as well. So I love how we don't have to be in cahoots, or we don't have to be against any type of scientific evidence, because a lot of the scientific evidence points to what the scripture says. Stability changes what humans can do. Okay, so we crave stability. If you know the river will return, you can plant more than you need for today. So they can plant their crops, they can get themselves prepared for each season. And if you know the season's cycle, you can store grain, plan trade, raise children who expect to see adulthood. And for Joseph, when he was in Egypt, this is something that he helped them to do as well, to store grain when they needed to. And what happens? Well, villages grow, surplus appears, role specializes, leadership emerges. Civilization doesn't start with this, though. It starts with reliable patterns. And it wasn't only Egypt. Other groups followed water into the Jordan Valley, the Mesopotamia, the Ethiopian highlands, and coastal zones. Everywhere that rivers or springs held steady, humans gathered. But even in these new, stable places, they didn't forget the old world. They remembered what it felt like when water ignored boundaries. Valleys drowning, lakes bursting, shorelines creeping inland. They remembered how quickly a livable world can become unlivable. In Isaiah chapter 33, verse 6, stability, wisdom, and knowledge become foundations. Understanding is the strength that sustains. That's my paraphrase of the RJPS. Now, those who had lived through collapse learned this the hard way, that stability is not guaranteed. These cycles are not guaranteed. But everything that we have that is stable is precious. Because out of that lesson, stories began to form, but told around fires and passed to children. So the spoken to generation, they told the stories. And there was a time when the world changed. I mean, this is what they were told. A time that the waters did not respect their place. A time creation felt like it was breaking. Those memories are the bridge between real events and later flood traditions that appear all across the ancient Near East. Now, why flood stories appear everywhere, right? Because if we're transitioning from the warm, wet, green Sahara to the dry, why do we have flood stories appearing all over? Well, as people spread out from the Sahara into Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and beyond, their surroundings changed, but their memories came with them. They now live beside this river with more predictable seasons, about a time when water did not behave. A lake bursting through its natural wall, a dry channel turning into a roaring river overnight, coastlines swallowed as the sea crept inland, storms that felt like the sky was tearing open. Now, between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, sea levels rose more than 400 feet. Mega lakes like ancient Lake Chad swelled and sometimes spilled catastrophically. The Nile had periods of extreme destabilizing floods. Flash floods ripped through desert wadis after rare, brutal storms. To the people living through this, flood didn't mean a gentle high water year. Flood meant the moment the world stops behaving. So when we see flood traditions in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, North Africa, the Levant, and beyond, we're not just seeing copied stories. We're seeing different people interpreting the same kind of terror. That the waters rose higher than they should have, the land we trusted disappeared, we had to start over. In Psalm chapter 29, verse 3 through 4, quick paraphrase, the voice of the waters is powerful. The floods lift their sound. Creation answers with force. That is exactly how it felt. Creation raised its voice. Now step into the Tanakh's flood account with that in mind. The text doesn't start with, there was a lot of rain. It starts with moral collapse. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 11 through 12, the earth became ruined. Violence filled the land. Creation's order was broken. The flood in Genesis is not just about strange weather. It's about a world where boundaries, natural and moral, are both violated. The deep is described as bursting open. The heavens pour beyond measure. Waters cross their proper limits. To a people who had seen lakes erupt, rivers move, and seas rise, this is recognizable language because the Tanakh does something new. It takes shared human memories of chaos and turns them into a theological warning. When creation's order is despised, the world feels it. So let's bring this from the flood to the worldview. We're going to bring order, boundaries, and meaning into this. Now, when people finally settle along rivers like the Nile and the Euphrates, they live with a strange blend of feelings. On one side, daily life shaped by steady rhythms, by the river, harvest, flowing water. On the other side, deep memory of a world where nothing held steady. That tension shaped how they understood reality. In that world, creation meant order. Look at how Genesis describes the beginning. Light is separated from darkness. Waters are separated from waters. Seas are gathered so land can appear. Lights are set in the sky to mark seasons and days. Quick paraphrase, I'm going to do Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. Lights are placed in the heavens to mark the appointed times, the days and the seasons, guiding the order of creation. To people who had lived through collapsing lakes and shifting rivers, this was not abstract. It was a description of the world as it ought to be, a world where boundaries hold and life has structure. Water became the symbol of what happens when those boundaries fall. Psalm 104, 6-9 says, "Waters once covered the earth like a garment. Boundaries were set, and they withdrew to the places appointed." So flood in this mindset is more than too much water. Flood is order losing its grip. So when the Tanakh tells the flood story, it is not simply recalling an ancient disaster. It is using a familiar experience, chaos in the form of water, to say something larger. That creation is built on boundaries, and life depends on those boundaries. When boundaries are ignored, the result feels like flood, even if the sky never opens. The flood becomes a picture of what happens when the world no longer respects the structure that makes it livable. So when we go back and we read about the flood, we know that it says in the scripture that God isn't going to destroy the world with a flood again, like how he did during that period of time. So we don't have to worry about that type of scenario. But what can we actually take from this? Well, what we could take from it is that even though that the skies may not open, our moral ways of doing things here on this earth, if we take those boundaries and we go beyond those boundaries of what we're supposed to do, then those boundaries are going to open up in other areas as well. And God has the way of intervening in these things all throughout the scripture and the Tanakh. So it's something that we need to keep in the back of our mind, that there are consequences to things, moral actions that people commit. Now, when the waters of the flood story finally recede, the ground is dry again, but the world is not simply just back to normal. The point of the narrative is not just survival. The point is, what now? The flood exposed something. Creation is order, but that order can be damaged from the human side. So here's Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. The Creator reflects that the human mind can lean toward harm from youth onward. In other words, chaos doesn't only come from storms and quakes. Chaos also comes from violence, corruption, and injustice. So the answer in the Tanakh is not, oh, don't worry, nothing bad will ever happen. The answer is covenant. Genesis chapter 9, verse 12-13. Here's a paraphrase. There is a sign set between the Creator and all living beings, a reminder across generations that stability will endure and waters will not again cut off all life. That sign is not magic. It is a declaration that creation has a structure and that humanity has a role inside that structure. Covenant says life is not random, actions matter. There is a way to live that supports order. There is a way to live that tears it apart as well. And later the Tanakh makes this connection explicit. In Deuteronomy chapters 11, verses 13-15, it says, if humanity walks in the ways set before it, loving what is right and staying on the path, rains come in their season, fields yield grain, and grass grows in the open land. The environment is not portrayed as a neutral backdrop. It is shown as a kind of mirror. When humanity respects the order of creation, life holds together. When humanity ignores that order, the world feels unstable again. For people whose ancestors filed a collapsing Sahara, this was not theory. The memory of losing land, water, and stability lived just beneath the surface. Covenant takes that memory and turns it into responsibility. Creation is not only a gift to enjoy, creation is a trust to guard. That idea sits at the heart of the flood story's ending and sets the stage for everything that follows in the Tanakh. So let's look at the rhythm beneath our origins. When you zoom out and look at everywhere we've traced in the episode, a pattern emerges. A green Sahara that felt secure, slowly losing its water. Sudden floods and violent storms in a land that was supposed to be drying. Mega lakes bursting, seas rising, valleys drowning, families forced to leave. Then, new life along rivers like the Nile and Euphrates, where water finally kept a rhythm. And from that rhythm, farming, storage, trade, cities, culture. Underneath it all, one lesson. The world is ordered, but that order is not guaranteed. Ancient people didn't treat this as trivia, they built their worldview on it. Creation in the Tanakh is not described as a random explosion or a God war. It is described as a careful separation, right? The separation from light from darkness, waters from waters, land from sea, seasons that mark time. Creation is structure. Psalm 33, verse 6 through 9, I like this paraphrase. By the word of the Creator the heavens were made. Waters are gathered and boundaries set. Let all the earth stand in awe, for creation speaks and it endures. So these flood stories then are not just about water. They're about what happens when that structure is violated, whether it's by climate chaos or by human corruption. The Genesis flood takes all those old memories of collapse, and it says, creation has an order. Humanity can damage that order. Chaos feels like flood, even if it doesn't come with water. Renewal is possible, but it comes with responsibility. That's why the story doesn't end with the ark on dry ground. It ends with covenant, a sign in the sky, a reminder that life is sacred, a reminder that creation is meant to be stable, and that humanity is not a spectator, but a partner in keeping that stability. The people who first heard these stories lived in the shadow of real climate upheaval. They had been seen boundaries fall. They had seen order rebuilt. The Tanakh takes that deep, ancient experience and turns it into sacred memory, a way of seeing the world where creation, morality, and human purpose are tied together. So God bless. I'll see you in the next one.